In the spring of 1943, high above the patchwork fields of occupied Europe, the pilots of the German Luftwaffe scanned the skies for their familiar adversaries. They knew the sleek, predatory shapes of the British Spitfire and the American P-38 Lightning. But now, a new silhouette appeared among the bomber formations, a shape so bulky, so contrary to the established principles of fighter design, that it drew murmurs of disbelief and then bursts of derisive laughter over the German radio channels. It was enormous, barrel-chested, with a blunt nose that seemed to punch a hole in the air rather than slice through it. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, but also mocked it as the Fliegen Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. This was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and to the seasoned aces of the Jagdverbände, it looked less like a thoroughbred fighter and more like a clumsy, overweight beast of burden, an easy kill ripe for the picking. They could not have been more wrong. What they saw as a weakness was the shell of an unimagined strength, and the laughter echoing in their headsets would soon be replaced by the chilling silence of a cockpit torn apart by an unstoppable storm of lead. The story of how this ridiculed aircraft became one of the most devastating weapons in the Allied arsenal is a testament to a uniquely American philosophy of air power, one built on industrial might, raw power, and an almost stubborn belief in brute force. It is a tale of engineering genius, pilot courage, and the brutal calculus of aerial warfare. As we delve deeper into this incredible story of transformation from mockery to terror, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss what unfolds next. The journey of the P-47. Thunderbolt is not just about a machine. It's about the turning of the tide in the air war over Europe, a shift that began not in the skies, but on the drawing boards of a visionary engineer, and in the sprawling factories of a nation committed to total war. The genesis of the P-47 lies with a Georgian immigrant, Alexander Kartveli, a brilliant aeronautical engineer who had become the chief designer for Republic Aviation. Kartveli was a man who thought in terms of power and durability. His design philosophy was not centered on the nimble, balletic grace of a Spitfire, but on the creation of a platform that could absorb immense punishment, carry an unprecedented amount of firepower, and be powered by the largest and most powerful engine available. His previous designs, like the P-35 and the P-43 Lancer, were steps in this direction, but they were mere preludes to the masterpiece he envisioned. In 1940, with war already raging across Europe, the United States Army Air Corps was desperately seeking a new generation of fighters. The initial requirements called for a lightweight interceptor, a design Republic pursued with its XP-47 and XP-47A concepts. However, reports flowing back from the Royal Air Force, which was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the Luftwaffe, painted a starkly different picture of modern air combat. The battles were being fought at higher altitudes, speeds were increasing, and the light machine guns of earlier fighters were proving inadequate against the latest German aircraft. The Air Corps, in a moment of crucial foresight, radically changed its requirements. They no longer wanted a lightweight interceptor. They needed a heavyweight champion. They needed a fighter that could outperform the best of the Luftwaffe, not just in speed and climb, but in firepower and the ability to operate effectively above 20,000 feet. Kartveli and his team were summoned to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The new specifications were daunting. The proposed aircraft would need to be far larger and more powerful than anything they had previously conceived. The heart of this new machine was to be the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a colossal 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that, in its early variants, could produce an astonishing 2,000 horsepower. This engine was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a monster. It was huge, heavy, and demanded an enormous airframe to house it. Kartveli embraced the challenge. He famously sketched the initial concept for the new fighter on the back of an envelope during a meeting with Air Corps officials. His idea was audacious. He would design the aircraft around the engine and its equally complex turbo supercharger system. This turbo supercharger was the key to high-altitude performance. A conventional engine loses power as it climbs into the thinner air of higher altitudes. A turbo supercharger uses the engine's exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which in turn drives a compressor that forces dense, oxygen-rich air into the engine, allowing it to maintain its power output at altitudes where enemy fighters would begin to gasp for air. However, the system was incredibly bulky. It required a labyrinth of intricate ductwork that had to run from the engine at the front of the aircraft, back to the turbine in the rear fuselage, and then all the way forward again to the engine's intake. Kartveli's genius was to use this engineering problem as the foundation of his design. He placed the massive turbo supercharger unit deep in the rear of the fuselage, beneath the pilot. The extensive ductwork required to connect it to the engine naturally created a deep, barrel-shaped fuselage. This arrangement not only solved the packaging problem, but also acted as a form of armor, with the pilot's cockpit sitting atop this complex and robust mechanical core. The result was the XP-47B, a prototype that dwarfed contemporary fighters. When it was rolled out for its first flight on May 6, 1941, it was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter aircraft ever built. Its empty weight was nearly 10,000 pounds, almost double that of a Spitfire. With a full load of fuel and ammunition, it tipped the scales at over 14,000 pounds. Test pilot Lowry P. Brabham, upon climbing into the cockpit for the first time, must have felt like he was strapping himself into a flying locomotive. The initial flight tests were a revelation. The XP-47B was astonishingly fast. It quickly surpassed 400 miles per hour in level flight, a stunning achievement for the time. The R2800 engine, combined with the turbo supercharger, gave it performance at high altitude that was simply unmatched. But the prototype was also plagued with problems. The immense power of the engine and the massive four-bladed propeller created powerful torque effects. The forces on the control surfaces at high speed were enormous, and the aircraft suffered from control surface flutter. The cockpit canopy had a tendency to jam, a potentially fatal flaw. The sheer complexity of the turbo supercharger system meant it was prone to fires and failures. These were not minor teething issues. They were fundamental challenges that had to be overcome before the aircraft could even be considered for mass production. Republic's engineers worked feverishly to iron out the kinks. They fitted an all-metal tail to combat flutter, redesigned the canopy, and refined the complex engine and turbo systems. But the most significant design feature was its armament. Kartveli equipped the Thunderbolt with a staggering 850 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. This was firepower on an industrial scale. A single one of these heavy machine guns could fire over 800 rounds per minute, and the P-47 carried a total of 3,400 rounds. A short, 2-second burst from a Thunderbolt would unleash a torrent of over 100 armor-piercing incendiary projectiles. It was enough to shred an enemy fighter in a single pass, to literally saw the wings off a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. This devastating firepower, combined with the aircraft's sheer size and rugged construction, hinted at its true potential. By late 1942, the first production P-47Bs began to roll off the assembly lines in Farmingdale, New York. The first units to receive the new fighter were the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by the dynamic and demanding Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke. The initial reaction from the pilots was one of profound skepticism. They were accustomed to lighter, more agile aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk. The Thunderbolt felt like a truck. It was slow to accelerate, had a ponderous roll rate, and its climb performance at lower altitudes was lackluster. One pilot famously quipped that in an emergency he could climb out, run along the wing, and make repairs. The cockpit was huge and filled with an intimidating array of dials and levers to manage the complex engine systems. They nicknamed it the Jug, not just for its shape, but because it seemed like an unstoppable, lumbering juggernaut. Zemke, however, saw the aircraft's potential. He drilled his pilots relentlessly, forcing them to learn the unique characteristics of their new mount. He knew that the P-47's strengths were not in low-altitude dogfighting, but in the high-altitude arena, where the air war over Europe was being decided. He taught them to use its incredible speed in a dive and its superior high-altitude performance. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any other aircraft in the sky. If a P-47 pilot got into trouble, he could simply nose over and outdive any German fighter that tried to follow. This zoom and boom tactic, diving on an enemy from above, making a single devastating firing pass, and then using the retained energy to climb back to altitude, would become the cornerstone of P-47 combat doctrine. In January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group, along with the 4th and 78th Fighter Groups, crated up their brand-new P-47Cs and shipped out to England. Their arrival was met with a mixture of curiosity and concern by their RAF allies. The British pilots, flying their elegant Spitfires, were aghast at the size of the American fighter. They couldn't believe something so large could be an effective combat aircraft. The initial months in England were a frustrating period of acclimatization. The pilots had to adjust to the notoriously bad European weather and the complexities of navigating over a foreign landscape. There were also technical issues. The early P-47s were plagued by problems with their radios, which made communication and coordination in the air nearly impossible. More critically, they lacked the range to escort the 8th Air Force's B-17 and B-24 bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany. The combat debut of the P-47, when it finally came on April 8, 1943, was a disaster. The 4th Fighter Group, on a sweep over the coast of France, ran into a formation of Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings. The German pilots, led by aces like Josef Pips Priller, were masters of their craft. They quickly identified the shortcomings of the American fighters. The P-47s were sluggish in acceleration and turning, and the American pilots, new to combat, were unable to effectively counter the aggressive tactics of the experienced Germans. The P-47's radios failed, leading to chaos and confusion. While no Thunderbolts were lost, they failed to shoot down a single German aircraft and were thoroughly outmaneuvered. The pattern was repeated in the following weeks. The Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned to avoid the P-47's strengths. They would not engage it at high altitude or in a dive. Instead, they would lure the heavy American fighters into low-altitude turning dogfights, where the superior agility of the FW-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 gave the Germans a decisive advantage. The German pilots' radio chatter was filled with contempt for the Indianer, their derogatory term for the Americans, and their clumsy flying tubs. Egon Mayer, a top German ace, dismissed the Thunderbolt as a good target, but not much of a fighter. The initial performance of the P-47 was so poor that the commander of the 8th Air Force, General Ira Eaker, seriously considered withdrawing it from combat and replacing it with the British Spitfire. The American pilots were frustrated and demoralized. They had been told they were flying the most advanced fighter in the world, yet they were being consistently outfought. The aircraft's reputation plummeted. It seemed the German mockery was justified. The Thunderbolt was too big, too heavy, and too inflexible for the fast-paced, swirling dogfights over Europe. But beneath the surface of these early failures, the seeds of a dramatic reversal were being sown. The pilots of the 56th and other groups were learning hard lessons with every mission. They were adapting their tactics, learning to fight as a team, and beginning to understand how to leverage the Jug's unique attributes. They discovered that while it couldn't turn with a Bf-109, it could outroll it at high speed. They learned that its rugged construction allowed it to absorb an incredible amount of battle damage and still bring its pilot home. Stories began to circulate of P-47s returning to base with entire cylinders shot off their engines, with huge sections of their wings and tails missing, riddled with hundreds of bullet holes. The aircraft was proving to be almost indestructible. And then there were the guns. When a P-47 pilot did manage to get a German fighter in his sights, the result was not a dogfight, but an execution. The sheer weight of fire from the 850s was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had ever encountered. Aircraft didn't just smoke or trail glycol. They disintegrated in mid-air, vanishing in a flash of orange flame and black smoke. The German pilots, who had laughed at the flying milk bottle, were beginning to learn a new and terrifying respect for the thunder it carried. The period of mockery was drawing to a close, and an era of fear was about to begin. The brutal lessons of the spring of 1943 forged a new kind of pilot and demanded a new approach to fighting. For the men of the 8th Air Force, survival depended on unlearning the classic dogfighting instincts and embracing the unique and often counterintuitive strengths of their 7-ton monster. The change did not happen overnight. It was a painstaking process, paid for in blood and shattered aircraft, led by commanders who refused to accept defeat. Foremost among them was Colonel Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group. A tough, uncompromising leader, Zemke was an engineer by training and a fighter pilot by instinct. He understood machines, and he understood men. He saw that the P-47 was not a fencer's rapier, but a giant's war hammer, and it had to be wielded as such. Zemke and other group commanders began to systematically dismantle and rebuild American fighter doctrine. They drilled into their pilots the cardinal rules of flying the Jug. Never, ever try to turn with a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. Maintain your speed at all costs. Energy was life. A slow thunderbolt was a dead thunderbolt. Their classroom was the cold, thin air 30,000 feet above the earth, and their instructors were the aces of the Jagdverbände. The core of the new tactics revolved around teamwork and the principle of mutual support. The Finger Four formation, adapted from the Germans themselves, became standard. 4 aircraft would fly in a staggered arrangement, with a leader and a wingman paired with another element of 2. This allowed for 360-degree visibility and ensured that no pilot was ever without a friendly set of eyes watching his tail. If engaged, the pilots were taught to perform a thatch weave, a crisscrossing maneuver where each element could cover the other, presenting any attacker with a head-on shot from another P-47. But the most important tactical innovation was the perfection of the dive and zoom attack. A P-47 formation would position itself high above the bomber's stream, using its superior high-altitude performance to gain an energy advantage. When German fighters rose to intercept, the Thunderbolts would plummet from the heavens. In a dive, the Jug was untouchable. Its immense weight gave it a phenomenal acceleration, pushing it to speeds over 500, even 600 miles per hour. A German pilot who tried to follow a P-47 in a steep dive risked having his own aircraft tear itself apart from compressibility effects. The Thunderbolt pilots would scream down on their targets, make a single devastating pass with their .850 calibers, and then use their retained momentum to climb back up to altitude, ready to strike again. It was a cold, methodical, and brutally effective way of fighting. While the pilots were rewriting the rule book in the skies, engineers on the ground were engaged in a parallel battle to unlock the aircraft's full potential. The first major breakthrough came in the form of a new propeller. The early P-47s were fitted with a narrow-bladed Curtiss electric propeller that, while effective at high speeds, was inefficient at lower speeds and altitudes. It struggled to convert the R-2800's immense horsepower into thrust, which contributed to the aircraft's poor acceleration and climb rate. The solution was the introduction of new, wide-bladed propellers, most notably the Hamilton Standard Hydromatic, or a new Curtiss electric model with paddle blades. These massive blades, much wider and more paddle-shaped, could grab a much bigger bite of the air. The effect was transformative. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt's rate of climb improved dramatically. Its acceleration became crisper. The ponderous beast began to feel more like a thoroughbred. Luftwaffe pilots, who had grown accustomed to easily out-climbing the Jug, were in for a rude shock when the new props began to appear in the summer and fall of 1943. The second critical innovation was the introduction of water injection. This system, known as war emergency power, allowed the pilot to inject a mixture of water and methanol directly into the engine's cylinders. The evaporating liquid would cool the fuel-air charge, allowing the engine to run at much higher boost pressures without detonating. When the pilot pushed the throttle to the firewall, he could get a temporary surge of an extra 300 to 400 horsepower. This was a life-saving burst of power, an ace up the sleeve that could be used to escape a dangerous situation or to close the final yards on a fleeing enemy. However, the most strategically significant improvement was the solution to the P-47's crippling lack of range. The early models could barely reach the German border from their bases in England. They could provide escort for the bombers only on the first leg of their perilous journey, leaving the big friends to fend for themselves over the most heavily defended parts of the Reich. The answer was the drop tank. Initially, these were crude, teardrop-shaped tanks made of plastic-impregnated paper. They were prone to leaking and could not be pressurized, limiting their effectiveness at high altitude. But they were a start. They allowed the Thunderbolts to push deeper, to stay with the bombers for a few more precious minutes. Soon, these were replaced by larger, more reliable 75-gallon and later 108-gallon steel tanks fitted to the belly of the aircraft. With these, the P-47's combat radius was extended dramatically. For the first time, American fighters could accompany the bombers all the way to targets in central and western Germany. The days of the unescorted bomber raid were numbered. The combination of new tactics and technological upgrades began to yield tangible results. On May 14, 1943, the 4th Fighter Group scored its first victories. By the summer, the tide was turning. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, were becoming masters of their craft, racking up an impressive tally of kills. The German pilots, who had once eagerly sought combat with the clumsy Jug, now approached it with a newfound caution. They had learned to respect its devastating dive speed and its incredible firepower. Nothing illustrated the P-47's other great virtue, its legendary toughness, better than the experience of Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was engaged in a swirling dogfight when he found himself on the receiving end of a devastating attack from the FW-190 of German ace Egon Mayer. Johnson's Thunderbolt was ripped apart by a storm of 20 mm cannon shells and 7.922 mm machine gun bullets. His canopy was shattered, spraying him with plexiglass shards. His instrument panel was destroyed. Hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, and his right rudder pedal was shot away. One cannon shell exploded behind his headrest, and another tore through the fuselage, severing his oxygen lines. Wounded and struggling to control his crippled aircraft, Johnson was convinced he was going to die. But the Jug refused to give up. The mighty R-2800 engine, despite taking hits, continued to churn away. The robust airframe, though riddled with holes, held together. Johnson managed to dive away, and, through a combination of sheer willpower and the aircraft's incredible resilience, flew his battered wreck all the way back across the English Channel. When he landed, ground crews were stunned. They counted over 200 entry and exit holes in his P-47. The aircraft was a write-off, but it had brought its pilot home. Johnson's story, and countless others like it, cemented the pilots' faith in their machine. They knew the Jug could take a beating that would have disintegrated any other fighter. It was their armored shield in the sky. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt, now in its definitive D-model form, had shed its early reputation and become a dominant force. The introduction of the bubble or teardrop canopy, which replaced the old high-backed razorback fuselage, gave the pilot superb all-around visibility, eliminating the dangerous blind spot to the rear. With its paddle blade propeller, water injection, and the ability to carry external fuel tanks, the P-47D was a mature and formidable fighting machine. It was now the primary escort fighter for the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign against Germany. The strategic objective was clear: to break the back of the Luftwaffe. General James Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in early 1944, issued a landmark order that changed the course of the air war. He famously declared, "The first duty of the 8th Fighter Command is to destroy German fighters." Escort pilots were no longer tethered to the bomber formations. They were now free to hunt. They were encouraged to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, in the air or on the ground. This was the beginning of the big week. In late February 1944, a massive, coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry. For 6 consecutive days, huge fleets of American bombers, escorted by over 1,000 fighters, including hundreds of P-47s, struck deep into the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to rise and fight. And the P-47s were waiting for them. The skies over Germany became the stage for some of the largest and most ferocious air battles in history. The German pilots, many of them young and inexperienced replacements for the veterans lost on the Eastern Front, were thrown against the confident, well-equipped American fighter groups. The results were catastrophic for the Jagdwaffe. In these brutal attritional battles, the Thunderbolt's strengths shone. The German pilots found themselves outmatched at the high altitudes where the engagements began. The P-47s would dive on their formations, their 8 guns spitting a volume of fire that was impossible to withstand. German ace Adolf Galland later wrote about the profound psychological effect of the American escort fighters. He noted the terrible mistake the Luftwaffe had made in underestimating the P-47. The sight of hundreds of Thunderbolts sweeping ahead of the bomber stream, clearing the skies, was a deeply demoralizing spectacle. The German fighter force was being systematically bled white. They were losing experienced pilots and aircraft at a rate they could not sustain. The American industrial logic was proving superior to German tactical brilliance. The United States could produce P-47s faster than the Germans could shoot them down, and it could train new pilots to replace its losses. Germany could not. The laughter that had greeted the P-47 in the spring of 1943 was now a distant memory, replaced by a grim respect and a growing sense of dread. The flying milk bottle had become the Luftwaffe's nightmare. Pilots like Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe, demonstrated the lethal potential of the Thunderbolt when flown with skill and aggression. Gabreski, like Zemke, was a master of the calculated attack, using the P-47's strengths to his advantage and refusing to be drawn into a fight on the enemy's terms. He and his fellow aces of the 56th, 4th, and 78th Fighter Groups were now the Predators. They had seized control of the skies over the Reich. The path was now being cleared for the final phase of the air war, and for the P-47, a new, even more destructive role was about to begin. The juggernaut had proven its might in the thin air of the stratosphere. Now it was about to descend and unleash its thunder upon the German war machine on the ground. By the spring of 1944, the strategic landscape of the air war over Europe had been irrevocably altered. The relentless pressure of the 8th Air Force's long-range fighter escorts had achieved its primary objective: Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe, though still dangerous and capable of mounting fierce resistance, was a shadow of its former self. It had been battered, bled, and forced onto the defensive. This new reality meant that the hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts taking off from English airfields each day often found the skies empty of enemy fighters. The hunters were left with no prey. But this hard-won dominance did not render the Thunderbolt obsolete. Instead, it unleashed it. The aircraft, conceived as a high-altitude interceptor, was about to find its true calling not in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere, but in the mud, smoke, and chaos of the battlefield below. Its second act would be its most destructive, transforming it from a fighter into a terror that would haunt the German army until the final day of the war. The qualities that had made the P-47 such a resilient and effective high-altitude fighter also made it an almost perfect platform for ground attack. Its sheer size and robust construction, once objects of mockery, were now its greatest assets. The Thunderbolt could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment from ground fire and keep flying. Its air-cooled Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was a significant advantage over the liquid-cooled engines of fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire. A single rifle-caliber bullet through a coolant line or radiator could cause a liquid-cooled engine to seize up in minutes, forcing the pilot to bail out or make a crash landing. The R2800, with its 18 individual cylinders, could have several cylinders shot completely off and still generate enough power to haul the battered airframe back to base. Pilots flew home with engines coughing oil and wings that looked like Swiss cheese, a testament to the machine's incredible durability. Furthermore, its large, strong wings were capable of carrying a staggering offensive load. In addition to its 850 caliber machine guns, the P-47 could be fitted with shackles to carry 2 500-pound or even 1,000-pound bombs. This gave a single fighter the bomb load of a dedicated light bomber from the early years of the war. Later, it was equipped to fire an array of 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, powerful projectiles that could knock out a tank or obliterate a fortified position. A fully loaded P-47D fighter bomber, or Jabo, as the Germans would come to call it, was one of the most heavily armed single-engine aircraft of the Second World War, and its primary armament, the 850 calibers, was a terrifyingly effective strafing weapon. Unlike cannon shells, which were fired at a slower rate, the Brownings produced a dense, concentrated stream of lead that could shred soft-skinned vehicles, locomotives, and infantry with horrifying efficiency. The grand stage for the P-47's new role was the invasion of Normandy in June 1944. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force, the tactical air arm assigned to support the ground invasion, flew thousands of sorties over France. Their mission was interdiction, to isolate the battlefield and prevent the Germans from moving reinforcements and supplies to the coast. They systematically attacked the French railway system, a campaign that became known as the Chattanooga Plan. P-47s roamed the countryside, strafing and bombing locomotives, tearing up tracks, and destroying bridges. The distinctive, deep-throated roar of the double Wasp engine became a constant, dreaded sound for German supply convoys. On D-Day itself, and in the brutal weeks of the Normandy campaign that followed, the Thunderbolts became the guardian angels of the Allied ground troops. Flying from hastily constructed airstrips in England and later in France, they formed a relentless aerial cabal over the front lines. They flew armed reconnaissance missions, prowling low over the landscape in search of targets of opportunity. A lone German tank, a column of trucks, a hidden artillery battery. Anything that moved was subject to a sudden, violent attack from the sky. The coordination between the ground troops and the air support was revolutionary. Forward air controllers, often traveling with the frontline infantry units, could call in an airstrike on a stubborn German strongpoint, and within minutes a flight of Thunderbolts would appear overhead to deliver a precise and devastating blow. They became, in effect, a form of flying artillery, able to respond with a speed and flexibility that conventional cannons could not match. For the German soldier on the ground, the experience was a living hell. The constant threat from the sky induced a state of psychological paralysis that came to be known as Jabo Schreck, or Jabo fever. The Jabos, overwhelmingly P-47s in the Normandy sector, owned the daytime sky. Any movement during daylight hours invited instant and lethal retribution. German memoirs from the period are filled with terrifying accounts of the Thunderbolts. They describe the helplessness of huddling in a ditch as the American fighters circled overhead like hawks, choosing their targets. They recall the terrifying sound of the .50 calibers, a noise one veteran described as like a giant tearing a massive sheet of canvas. They saw their comrades, their vehicles, and their tanks ripped apart in spectacular explosions of fire and shrapnel. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself, commanding the German forces in Normandy, noted the crippling effect of Allied air power. He complained that the Jabos made it impossible for him to move his panzer divisions during the day, forcing them to undertake slow, difficult night marches that left them exhausted and vulnerable. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's own staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter, severely injuring the field marshal and taking him out of the battle for good. The P-47's reign of terror continued as the Allies broke out of Normandy and raced across France. The German retreat often turned into a rout, and the Thunderbolts were there to make it a slaughter. The most infamous example was the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, where a large part of the German 7th Army was encircled. As the Germans tried to escape through a narrow gap, they were subjected to a week of non-stop bombardment from Allied artillery and aircraft. The P-47s had a field day. The roads in the pocket were jammed bumper to bumper with German tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons, presenting an almost unbelievable concentration of targets. The Thunderbolt pilots dove down again and again, strafing, bombing, and rocketing the trapped columns until the entire area was a smoldering, twisted graveyard of men and machines. The carnage was so complete that some pilots reported feeling sickened by the scale of the destruction they had wrought. As winter approached, the P-47's relentless campaign continued. But in December 1944, the German army mounted its last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. Taking advantage of a prolonged period of thick fog and snow that grounded the Allied air forces, German panzer divisions smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest. For the first week of the battle, the Allied ground troops fought desperately and alone, deprived of their aerial protectors. The German advance rolled forward, creating a deep bulge in the front line. Then, on December 23rd, the weather broke. The skies cleared, and the Jabos returned with a vengeance. What followed was one of the most decisive displays of tactical air power in history. The German armored columns, which had advanced rapidly along the narrow winding roads of the Ardennes, were now caught in the open, their supply lines stretched thin. The pilots of the 9th Air Force's P-47 groups took off from frozen, snow-covered airfields and fell upon the Germans with unparalleled ferocity. It was a turkey shoot. They systematically located and destroyed the spearheads of the German attack. Tanks were brewed up by rockets, supply trucks were strafed until they exploded, and infantry were cut down in the snow. The P-47s, flying in support of the besieged town of Bastogne, and all along the front, shattered the momentum of the German offensive. They destroyed hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles, starving the German panzers of the fuel and ammunition they needed to continue their advance. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the German 5th Panzer Army, later stated that it was the return of the Allied fighter-bombers more than any other single factor that doomed his offensive to failure. In the final months of the war, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and advanced into the heart of Germany, the P-47s continued their work of annihilation. Their targets were now the last vestiges of the German war machine's circulatory system. They attacked trains, barges on canals, and any vehicle they could find on the autobahns. The final statistics compiled after the war are staggering and speak to the sheer scale of the Thunderbolt's contribution. In the European theater alone, P-47s were credited with destroying 3,752 enemy aircraft in the air and another 3,315 on the ground. But the ground attack numbers are even more mind-boggling. 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles and tanks, and 68,000 trucks. These are not just numbers. They represent the systematic dismantling of a modern industrial state's ability to wage war. While the P-47's fame was cemented in the skies over Europe, it also served with distinction in the Pacific and China-Burma-India theaters. There, its ruggedness and firepower were equally valued. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, a new version, the P-47N, was developed. It featured a redesigned wing with a larger fuel capacity, giving it the extreme range needed to escort B-29 superfortresses on their long-distance raids against the Japanese home islands. From its troubled debut to its final days of dominance, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt flew more than 500,000 sorties and carved out a unique and undeniable legacy. It was the most produced American fighter aircraft of the war, with 15,683 units rolling off the assembly lines. It was a machine that perfectly embodied the American industrial and military philosophy of the era. It was big, it was powerful, it was incredibly tough, and it was produced in overwhelming numbers. It was not the most beautiful or the most agile fighter in the sky, but it was arguably the most versatile and resilient. It could meet the Luftwaffe's best at 30,000 feet and then descend to the deck to become a tank-busting terror. The German pilots who had laughed at the flying milk bottle in 1943 had learned a terrible lesson. They had mistaken size for clumsiness and overlooked the brute force and industrial logic it represented. The Thunderbolt was a juggernaut in every sense of the word, an unstoppable force that cleared the skies, shattered an army, and proved that in the brutal calculus of total war, mockery can quickly turn to terror. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the P-47 Thunderbolt. If you found this story of engineering, courage, and transformation as fascinating as we did, please subscribe to our channel for more meticulously researched documentaries on the machines and people who shaped our history.